I'm delighted to see so many people here to join us for this important launch, to hear about two reports which focus on social welfare advice during the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm Amanda Finlay. I'm chair of the public legal education charity Law for Life, and I'm a council member of Justice. The reports we're going to hear about today give us some really fascinating insights into the impact of the pandemic on people and on the providers who help those experiencing problems. The first report, prepared by Dr. Naomi Kreutzfeldt at Westminster University and Diane Secchi at Simmons & Simmons, looks at how frontline advice providers have adapted to the pandemic in delivering advice in social welfare law. And the second report explores the idea of vulnerability and how it applies to both those experiencing social welfare related issues, as well as the organisations operating to give them advice. Let's just have a bit of housekeeping first. Following the presentations, we're going to have a Q&A session. So please ask questions in the Q&A box. Please give the name of the person that the question is addressed to, and we'll try our best to get through as many questions as possible. The links to the reports will be provided in the chat box during the presentations, but please don't use the chat box for anything else. We'll only be looking for questions in the Q&A, so don't put your questions in the chat box. The reports will be circulated to attendees after the meeting, and a survey will also be circulated. So please take a couple of minutes to complete the survey following the meeting. I'd now like to introduce the panel. I think we're on speaker view, but the panel is Dr. Naomi Kreutzfeldt, who is co-chair of the Administrative Justice Council Academic Panel, Diane Secchi, who is also a member of the AJC Pro Bono and Advice Sector Panel, Dr. Daniel Newman, who's the Senior Lecturer in Law at Cardiff University, Dr. Jess Mant, a Lecturer in Law at Cardiff University, and Dr. Faith Gordon, who's the Senior Lecturer in Criminology at the Australian National University. And Faith is joining us from Australia late at night, and where she says they're experiencing typical English weather. Actually, I think it's a bit more than typical English weather. It looks pretty wet where you are, Faith. So thank you very much for joining us. I'd just like to say a few words to set these reports in context. And I'm going to do that drawing on the various things that I've done over the last 11 years since I retired from the Ministry of Justice. I've had a personal, long-standing interest in vulnerability and its manifestation in social welfare law, and I worked on that for many years as a policymaker. As Deputy Chair of the Low Commission, we recommended that advice should be delivered in the places and through the people with whom the vulnerable were familiar and where their needs were understood. And actually, over the years since we made that recommendation, I've seen it become more and more important, and never more so, and actually never more challenging to achieve than in this last year. As chair of the Justice Working Group on Preventing Digital Exclusion from Online Justice, I highlighted in my postscript to that report that most people were vulnerable when facing legal issues and court proceedings, and even the digitally capable might need support, while the digitally challenged would need both digital and legal advice and intensive support. And I was just so heartened to read this personal view carried out, supported by the research that you will be presenting on this morning, because when I first said this, I think a lot of people were reluctant to listen. As a member of the Ministry of Justice Litigants in Person Engagement Group, I have argued this point more and more strongly since the start of the Digital Assistance Programme run by the Good Things Foundation. And eventually, after very poor and ineffective take-up in the first year of that pilot, we saw design changes to the pilot, which have allowed advice and law centres to provide digital assistance in a setting where legal advice would also be available. And amazingly to some, but not to others, we found that actually more people were being helped and were being helped more effectively. We're now at a very crucial watershed as HMCTS re-tender for the provision of digital assistance. And they're actually tendering for digital assistance. But the fact remains that most people who need digital assistance will also need help with the legal aspects of their problem, and will probably have clusters of other problems as well. As chair of Law for Life, I see constantly the feedback from users of our website Advice Now, who were at their wits' end and without access to a lawyer or any help, but actually have successfully, with help from our online resources, they've successfully navigated complex family issues, appealed their personal independence payment decision, negotiated with the landlord, and so on, and so on. It's been quite interesting how seeing a population, our responders to our user survey, about half of them have a disability and nearly half are on very low incomes. So these are actually people who are not the most vulnerable or the most excluded, but they're people who find things pretty tough to tackle at the best of times, but with the right sort of resources, they find they can actually challenge issues which they had previously thought were impossible to deal with. As a member of the Advice Sector Roundtable, I've heard feedback on the impact of the pandemic and on remote working and the impact of both of these on the sector. So I welcome this report from the AJC, which confirms many of the issues I have heard over the last year. The challenge of moving to remote working and how people have met it, or in some cases not been able to meet it, and why. The tsunami of need, which is likely to grow even further after protection against eviction, furlough, and the increase in state benefits are removed. The appearance of a new type of client, newly impoverished, ignorant of welfare benefits, debt and hardship, but digitally capable. Their sharper elbows may reduce capacity of the traditional organisations to reach out to their traditional most vulnerable group. I think this is a really urgent issue. And most of those organisations have seen, or rather not seen, the disappearance of the traditional group of the most vulnerable who sorely miss face-to-face contact and support. Now, I'm going to move on to the panelists who know so much more about this than I do. And I'm going to invite Naomi and Diane to make their presentations. And I think Diane is going first. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda, and welcome everybody. So this is social welfare law advice provision during the pandemic in England and Wales, looking at a typology of needs. This draws on the digitisation survey. And if we could have the next slide, please, Heidi. So here we've got information about the Administrative Justice Council. Naomi and myself actually undertook this survey to test out what the land was like following a real kind of drastic shift to remote working. Next slide, please. Okay, so the overarching theme and background to the welfare pandemic survey is access to social welfare law advice in general and how this has been affected by digitisation and the pandemic in particular. The pandemic has made the need for remote advice delivery a premature reality, leaving many vulnerable groups without access to services. So this discussion today is situated in the overall context of the court digitisation agenda that the Ministry of Justice has been pursuing since 2016 under the Court Modernisation Programme. The pandemic survey pulled on the findings of a previous survey, which was digitisation and accessing justice in the community. That was carried out under the Administrative Justice Council. The digitisation survey was intended to explore the broader advice sector about the potential effects on service delivery when moving to a digital justice system. This was set in a framework around assisted digital, which we've just heard Amanda allude to, which HMCTS at that time were proposing as a way forward. The digitisation survey was carried out before the pandemic. It was carried out in early autumn 2019. And the main findings were, one, that there was a high level of need for digital assistance. And respondents reported that between 35 and 50% of their service users would require digital assistance. But there were barriers preventing meeting demand, barriers such as lack of IT, lack of staff, lack of space, lack of specialist knowledge, and so forth. Lack of funding was also preventing scaling up to meet digital demand and also to provide advice. Again, what Amanda has just touched on, it's not about just providing digital assistance, but that advice as well. And 4, organisations were unable to meet demand across areas of social welfare law. So the follow-up pandemic welfare advice survey wanted to understand whether, with a very abrupt shift to remote working, this had highlighted the key findings under the digitisation reports. Next slide, please. So here we've just got a really loose and broad overview of the advice sector landscape in England and Wales. There's far more going on than these slides allude to, because I think what's coming out throughout the pandemic is that there are lots of groups actually delivering advice in kind of faith centres that just go under the radar of the typical advice sector landscape that we're familiar with. But here we've got the National Advice Services, Citizen Advice, the Law Centre Network. There are many other independent advice agencies within the voluntary sector, including not-for-profit organisations, charities, housing associations, and community centres. There's also specialist advice services, including those that provide legal advice, and many of these are members of umbrella bodies such as Advice UK and Advice Services Alliance. This paper focuses on the provision of welfare advice, and welfare advice is quite broad. It covers areas such as debt, housing, employment, benefits, education, and so forth. Next slide, please. So methodology, the methodology used for the pandemic welfare advice survey. It was sent to 328 service providers. Again, many of those providers mentioned in the previous slide. There was a 37% response rate. Although anonymous, respondents were able to leave their details if they felt able to do so. It was live between September the 14th and October the 19th, 2020. So this is a sampling, this sampling frame is limited, not representative, but nevertheless, it gives a snapshot of what is going on. And through that snapshot, what we saw was some key and developed share themes emerging. And I'll pass over to Naomi.
Thank you very much. I hope you can all hear me. So I'm going to talk about our data that we collected from the survey that Diane just outlined. So the 4 themes were change in demands. So the sector had to respond to a significant change in demands. And the providers, for example, had to adapt to both the delivery of remote service and in many cases, the changing demographic of its service users. Some of the advisors reported that the profile of their clients had changed, that they'd lost touch with certain communities, for example, BAME clients. The latter group, as well as other groups, of course, may be more likely to experience social welfare problems to start with, where they have existing legal needs, which means that the groups who are already struggling are affected further. The service overall is slower due to several factors. So, for example, most advice providers are working with a reduced capacity, which also means that they have a loss of volunteers. And while the volume of contacts or the requests for particular assistance is going up, especially the request for assistance in employment issues is going up. And the advisors aren't able to provide the same level of service and advice, including the emotional support for their clients that they're used to when dealing with them face to face. And this makes the process much more time consuming for all parties. And also, as was mentioned by Amanda and Diane, that the clients have much reduced access when it's remote, and it's mainly due to digital exclusion, and their needs are often more complex, and they're then also present as much more urgent during the time of the pandemic, which is even more urgent and difficult for this remote service delivery. The next theme is the move from face-to-face to mainly telephone advice. So the advisors reported that the interaction on the phone is just not as good as being able to see their clients face to face. And that mode of communication poses special difficulties for clients who, for example, are autistic, are elderly, have anxiety disorders, have sensory impairments or language barriers or literacy issues. So as a result of that, the advisors spend much more time on every case, and especially for those clients with more complex needs. So again, we find that the existing challenges have been reinforced during the pandemic. The next theme is the move from paper to digital. So many cases, as you know, need evidence. So that evidence is in form of a document, which means that people have to upload documents as evidence, and some find that very difficult, especially those who struggle with technologies. So the advisors reported that some clients actually mailed the documents, which then the very tight deadlines were very difficult to meet, because the advisors then had to go back to their offices once a week to get all the mail. So it all delayed the cases. And it was just an ongoing challenge to communicate effectively with clients. The last point on this slide is the well-being of advisors. That came up as a big theme. So the respondents highlighted that they were really struggling to work in isolation at home, where they were so used to having a chat with their colleagues over break time or just checking in with their supervisor at work. So they felt that there was a real loss of that, and that they themselves felt quite isolated and in need of that social interaction with their colleagues. Could I have the next slide, please? Just a general overview of our data set. So we put the n number of respondents to each question at the top. So the main respondents were local authorities, other volunteer sectors, and law centres and solicitors. And I just wanted to mention that the 10.6% of other were specialist charities like NHS, Legal Advice Centre, Dial, Welfare Rights Service, and the Department for Communities or National Charity. Could I have the next slide, please? So we asked the question of what type of welfare law advice they provided. And the main response was welfare benefits, debts, housing, and employment. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. We asked them how effective the remote advice delivery was in their experience during the pandemic. And there was an overwhelming response rate of that it was very effective and fairly effective, of both 20.8% and 68.5%. I hope those numbers are correct. I've not got my right reading glasses on. But what was interesting in this is that this was the most common method of communication, was actually the phone and email. So we're not talking here about the digitalization agenda and using video link or other hybrid models, but this is actually face-to-face meeting being replaced by mainly a telephone, and that worked quite well. Could I have the next slide, please? This is just recapping what Diane mentioned earlier, what the four outcomes were, four findings were of the digitalization report. And what we did in our paper, building on these outcomes, could I have the next slide, please? This is and academics love providing theoretical frameworks and concepts, which of course we all know that the real life is much more fuzzy and blurry, but this is a way to, based on our empirical data collection, to grasp the concept of the advice delivery and its challenges of access during the pandemic. And the aim of this framework is to group the phenomenon of advice provision into these categories based on the patient-centered accessibility framework from Levesque in 2013. And this model was attractive to us because it grasps and conceptualizes access, which we feel that there's a direct crossover. So very briefly about this model, if we look at the 5 main categories in the middle as the stepping stones of the center in the model, their social welfare needs, perception of those needs, advice provision settings, the access to those settings, and the outcome. There are 2 main perspectives on this pathway. In the top, the service providers, and at the bottom, the capacities of users. So to make the service accessible, the providers need to ensure 4 dimensions of accessibility: approachability, remote delivery, availability, and presence. And the 6 dimensions at the bottom relate to users' abilities to interact with the categories to realize that access. And they include capacity to perceive a need, the capacity to seek help, the capacity to reach advice, the capacity to access an advice setting, the capacity to engage and understand with the advisor and the advice provided. And then there's a category that was mentioned by Amanda in the beginning, that of unmet needs. So there is this whole group that, due to lack of digital capability, just cannot access the system. Could I have the last slide, please? So we conclude with 3 main areas of concern coming out of our empirical analysis: that there's a concern about the advisor's ability to deliver the advice during the current setting, as well as their own well-being. A concern about clients' capacity to access and take full advantage of the services, as we've seen that access is limited. And a concern about those clients who've been cut off from the services due to the pandemic and the remote delivery, which we could call the digitally abandoned, because there's this whole new group of people that suddenly is invisible to the services as they've been offered at the moment. And I will stop here. And of course, once our paper is out, we'll share it, and then we'll look forward to your comments. Thank you very much.
Naomi and Diane, thank you both very much indeed. That's absolutely fascinating. I'm going to encourage everybody to think about putting questions into the Q&A as the presentation unrolls. And before I invite our next 3 speakers, I'm just going to let you know we're going to have a minute's silence at 12 noon for this 1 year on from when the pandemic started. So Heidi is going to remind me if I get too absorbed in the presentations, but I think that will probably come at roughly the time that Faith and Jess and Daniel have finished making their presentation, but just to let them know about that. And thank you, Diane and Naomi, for sticking so brilliantly to time. I'm going to introduce Jess Mand, Faith Gordon and Daniel Newman, who are going to present on their research. And I leave it to you 3 to decide what your batting order is.
There we go. Hi everyone, I'm Dan. I'm opening the batting, I guess. This is our presentation, Vulnerability, Legal Need and Technology. I'm really hoping you don't hear my little boy in the background. He's on his tablet, listening to the silliest songs I've ever heard about monsters under the bed, but I think it's okay. So I'm going to talk us through a little bit, first of all, what we're going to do in this presentation today. So the overview, which Jess will click on to now. Jess is in charge of doing the presentation. She's doing a sterling job. This shows the three parts of our presentation. I'm going to begin by talking a wee bit about the theory we've used for our paper. Our research is framed by something called vulnerability theory. So this is an approach which says that we're all vulnerable, but we've got different levels of resilience, and that impacts our ability to manage that vulnerability. Don't worry, the theory isn't the focus of our paper today. It's not some big, heavy theoretical thing, but it does underpin our data. So we wanted to give you at least a little flavor of how we approach the topic. Next up, Jess will drill down into some of the main findings of our research. We thought this was going to be a seamless thing where we'd have this symbiotic idea of when to go on to the next slide, but I don't think we have yet. So still on the overview, next Jess will go down to the main findings of our research. She'll talk about how the pandemic has impacted legal need, and she'll share a little bit of what we were told by those on the front line. Just going to be a brief overview of what practitioners told us, and it would be improved by conversations with more practitioners. We'd love to pick it up in the Q&A if that's something that interests people. And then finally, Faith is going to talk about technology looking forward in the future, the things technology might help with and the things that might cause problems. We're going to flag some of these issues up, and again, we could develop them in the Q&A. It'd be a great use of this exchange between academia and practice. So vulnerability theory. When we talk about vulnerability in policy terms, very often the focus is on one particular vulnerable group or another that needs help. You know, how do we work out whether they're vulnerable enough to justify help? If they are, then where are they? How do we help them? That's not the approach we take in this paper. We have this broader idea that everyone is vulnerable. And this speaks to what Amanda was saying at the beginning about, you know, digital exclusion. It's not just one particular group or another that needs help. That ties into our approach of vulnerability theory. So all of us will need help at different times. On the left of that slide, there is a quote from Martha Feynman about how vulnerability is universal and constant, but it's also particular, varied, and unique. And we use Martha Feynman's vulnerability theory to help us understand what vulnerability means in practice. So austerity politics in particular have always treated vulnerability as something that's only experienced in exceptional circumstances. Using this definition helps us to understand that everyone is vulnerable to different degrees at different times in their lives. You know, we're all vulnerable in that any of us could lose our jobs or fall ill at any moment. And that's been made really obvious by the pandemic. But we have different factors like the strength of our support networks, our educational backgrounds, maybe financial capital we possess, which could make us more or less resilient in how we deal with these crises when they emerge. And we think that the state has got a role to play in providing resilience to citizens. If everyone is vulnerable, then the state should take some responsibility for cushioning that. And this can be seen to underpin the notion of the welfare state and a large part of the role of civil legal aid to help people get recourse to a properly funded system of legal advice to enforce their rights to these services if needed. The advice sector, publicly funded advice, free to access advice, is a really important source of resilience to help people deal with their vulnerability. There are a few areas where that's more obvious, I think, when it's something like welfare benefits. And the pandemic is a crisis that made many people realize that they're vulnerable for the first time. And many people who actually were acutely aware of their vulnerability before are now seeing that vulnerability manifest in new ways. And we saw that in our research, and it'll come out over the next few slides when we look at the huge numbers of people who have been coming to the advice sector during the pandemic and the way that many of those had never used services before. On the right there, this slide, is a little bit more detail about the advice sector itself, because it's not just individuals who are vulnerable. These points speak to some of the challenges that the advice sector has faced under austerity before the pandemic, and how this undermines the resilience of the sector, and therefore the sector's ability to give resilience to the people who rely upon it today. So when we apply vulnerability theory, we include the advice sector itself. We think institutions can be vulnerable, and that different institutions have different levels of resilience. For example, the advice sector is in part supported by the UK government, and we suggest that successive UK governments have reduced the resilience of the advice sector. And so they've undermined the role of the state to provide resilience to citizens, which has restricted the ability of the advice sector to deal with the deluge of legal need that's been faced under the pandemic. Those working in the sector are trying their hardest and doing incredible jobs, but to some degree, they're hamstrung by years of neglect over just what they can do. And just to go through those points very briefly. The first point is about the diminishing availability of welfare and state support, which was most obvious in LASPO. The amount of money for legal aid has been slashed. We've seen lawyers' fees reduced. We've seen large chunks of public funding for social welfare law removed. So what there was £750 million cut from the £2.2 billion legal aid budget. Something like welfare benefits, part of that was the move to fixed fees. So no matter how much work someone puts into a welfare benefits case, you'll get this fixed fee of £208, whereas previously hourly rates meant you might get something of what you actually put into that case. And it's not just the sector that's impacted by this, individuals are impacted too. So, large parts of civil legal aid were moved out of scope. And you see that in welfare benefits, the way that legal advice welfare benefits fell by 99% before and after LASPO. In the year before LASPO, I think 91,000 people got legal advice or welfare benefits problems. In the year after, it's less than 500 people. That second point is that because of the unviable nature of legal aid work, we've seen a loss of practitioners and skills. So the number of not-for-profit agencies and legal aid firms offering social welfare law collapsed by more than a third since LASPO. And one of the things that leads us towards is advice deserts. In this country, in Wales, in 2012, we had 31 organisations that had welfare benefits, legal aid contracts. Now we've got one for the entire country. And that final point is a quote from the Legal Aid Practitioners Group that small practices offering social welfare law are now on their knees. Only 1 in 8 cases get taken forward because of a lack of legal aid. So the sector is as vulnerable as the individuals using it. And we had this lens of vulnerability theory to help us understand this as context for what we saw during the pandemic. And Jess is going to pick up on that. When I pass over to her, she'll talk a little bit about our data.
Brilliant. Thank you, Dan. Yeah, absolutely. So as Dan's already outlined, obviously the sector and the context in which the sector was operating was already under a significant amount of strain. And I think that's something which we really emphasize in this paper, is that although we are focused on the impact of the pandemic, this is very much a pre-pandemic problem. And it's obviously been complicated by all of the factors that we've seen in the last year or so. So to understand how the pandemic has impacted on this landscape and kind of how all of these things intersected together, we had 2 important sources of data. And the first thing was that we analysed the minutes from a series of advice sector roundtables, which were organised by LawWorks during the first lockdown back in 2020. And so those roundtables took place over a period of 6 months, from March onwards to about September 2020. And then we reinforced that by using our own connections with the advice sector to find some case studies through law centres. And we talked to them about the impact of the pandemic on their work, and particularly the way that they use technology in responding to the changing needs that they were facing in the pandemic. And so what we found was that there were kind of 3 main ways that coronavirus and the original lockdown across the UK had changed the ways that people were experiencing social welfare problems, and the way also that the advice sector was able to support those different people. And in terms of the way that people experience need, this was really interesting because we found that there were multiple different intersecting factors which were affecting this experience of legal need. So, for example, firstly, there was a backlog of delayed court cases which couldn't go ahead due to the lockdown restrictions. And what that means in practice is that there are still large categories of people who are contending with unresolved issues and falling into situations where their problems are potentially escalating into more serious or perhaps different issues and compounding situations. And then at the same time, there's also an influx of people, as the previous report and Dan has already explained, there's an influx of people who are experiencing legal problems for the first time. They're being confronted with their vulnerability in the sense that they're facing perhaps employment precarity or financial precarity as a result of the pandemic, or perhaps closure of businesses and services during lockdowns. And what all of this means is that there is a greater level of need overall for support from the advice sector, but that the sector itself is also having to cope with the impact of coronavirus and the lockdowns, because services are having to operate remotely and having to deal with different logistical challenges which come with managing new ways of working within this context of having very limited resources to be able to invest in new methods of delivery. And a really interesting thing that came out of our data was specifically this division between what we've called new legal need as opposed to existing legal need. And so the increased number of people who are experiencing problems and seeking help from the advice sector for the first time are these people who we've termed new legal needs. So for example, there's been an enormous increase in the amount of queries relating to employment law, and a whopping 550% increase in people claiming universal credit for the first time. And these people exist in contrast to what we've called existing legal need, which refers to those traditional client groups who have consistently relied on the advice sector for support in relation to the problems that they experience as a result of living through perhaps more precarious consequences in general due to the austerity measures and the impact of various policies over the last few decades. And a real concern is the way that these existing legal need clients may be disappearing from advice services due to the reality that they would be the ones who traditionally would have relied upon face-to-face services, perhaps more holistically provided support, and the simultaneous reality that, of course, those services are already overwhelmed by the demand from clients experiencing new legal need. And so to illustrate all of this, it's perhaps useful to look at some of our case studies. So this first case study is, it draws attention to the reality that many people who have traditionally relied on this kind of face-to-face support, these existing client groups, simply struggle to make use of the appointment-based system, which has to be used when services are delivered remotely. I think that we've all become quite used to having our days very scheduled in terms of Zoom calls or virtual meetings. And of course, that requires you to have kind of consistent lines of communication or schedules which are consistent, and that isn't necessarily the reality for clients who perhaps may come into face-to-face services at random points because it fits with what they're doing that day, or the different requirements they have to deal with day to day, which are unpredictable. And so Sue James, for example, says that she sees clients who often come in because their mobile phone has been stolen, or perhaps they've had to sell it for various reasons, and he simply wouldn't be able to use email or the internet in the way that's expected in this new world that we're living in. And this second case study demonstrates also that the reality that this new legal need, this influx of need which is coming out of the pandemic, it's not temporary. In reality, it's here to stay, because it might be easy to assume that issues related to employment, perhaps debt or housing, might all go away once the pandemic has ended, once we successfully roll out the vaccine and return to our normal lives. But in reality, the sector have already recognised that a lot of these problems are in practice stored up and will continue to increase after the furlough scheme ends and the true economic implications of the pandemic really come to light. And then lastly, this case study and all of them really revealed that the advice sector is trying to do two very difficult things. Firstly, they're trying to support the significant numbers of people who are experiencing legal need at the moment. And secondly, they're trying to maintain contact with these disappearing groups who are no longer actively seeking their services. And all of this is really underpinned by a really significant tension, which is that they simply can't achieve all of this with the limited resources that they have available. And their capacity to support people is not just something which is rooted in the pandemic or rooted in the impact of the pandemic. It's rather something which has been eroded for years due to austerity measures and punitive policies aimed at people who rely on social welfare. So it's important to remember that the sector was already under significant strain before the pandemic, with the vast majority of law centres having very little in the way of reserve funding and most services relying on short-term grants for income, working year to year with very little ability to financially plan for unexpected crises such as the COVID pandemic. So I'm going to pass over to Faith now, who's going to pick up on the themes related to technology specifically.
Thanks, Jess. Firstly, if it's okay, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I work and live, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and acknowledge that sovereignty of these lands was never ceded. So as Jess and Dan have mentioned, I'm going to chat just a bit about what we find in relation to technology. And some of this actually touches on a lot of what Amanda mentioned in her introduction and resonates with a lot of the points that she's made earlier. So our research identified a range of benefits of technology for the sector's ability to respond to the really rapid and quite quick move to remote working and advice delivery. And the case studies, it emerged that there were a number of challenges for the advice sector in pivoting to remote working. There was a widespread use of video conferencing and emails. The sector found that online meetings were in some instances beneficial because it reduced expenses and time traveling for them and for the clients. They also mentioned about the benefits of online training for staff and also for volunteers. And they talked about it providing the opportunity to properly use the case management systems which they felt had been underused before the pandemic, and also sharing resources between organisations, as well as this increased diversity of communication methods, which include the increased use of email and even some platforms such as WhatsApp to reach some clients. In our research, we've identified that there may be a bigger role really for technology in the delivery of advice services in the future post-pandemic. There's already a number of examples of innovation within the sector in England and Wales, and we know that some platforms are already showing potential to be valuable in relation to, for example, advice for direct survivors of domestic violence who are eligible for legal aid towards legal services. And so it might be that some similar innovations can be useful for easing some of the current demands for free advice going into the future. The idea of directing clients to other sources for help is likely to be particularly useful for those new clients who rely on the advice sector, who, as Amanda said in her introduction, are likely to be generally more confident and digitally competent. So those users might be assisted by different technological innovations, such as a greater use and creation of online guides and advice platforms such as live chat functions or AI chatbots for that kind of initial support in those initial stages. And it might be that there is the potential to ease then the demand on services and enable organisations to devote more time to providing that immediate and targeted assistance that is needed for the traditional sector clients who are at risk of disappearing and falling into cycles that, as Naomi mentioned in her presentation, that can often escalate for those clients. Our research indicates that significant evaluation of platforms needs to account for the diverse user perspectives in assessing the effectiveness of technology. The digital divide, which Amanda mentioned in her introduction, has meant that existing inequalities have been further exacerbated. In the case studies, we heard of how the sector had been trying to get back in contact with their more regular client base. And some of the innovation that they used, linking with food banks to get, paper flyers and leaflets to their, their existing client base, because they had not been able to access the services remotely. And it is important to kind of consider this balance when we're talking about technological innovation. It's quite a delicate balance. The means of helping to meet the needs of those for whom kind of those methods are appropriate, such as those with new legal need, could be beneficial because it can free up the time and space for advisors to continue in the very vital outreach strategies to meet the needs of the more hidden population groups who might not be able to access those services digitally. In our case studies, reflective of what Naomi mentioned about her findings in the research that she has collectively conducted, that it was those with English as an additional language and BAME groups who and those experiencing homelessness that our case studies found had fallen off the radar of the legal centres. In other jurisdictions, such as Australia, we do have here quite a long-standing use of technology and innovation in relation to the work of community legal centres. That's for a number of reasons, including just how vast the country is and those in rural and regional areas getting access to legal advice when they need it. Other social groups, such as young people, the main community legal centre free advice is Youth Law Australia for young people, children and young people here, and that is all provided using technology, so phone advice mainly, and website and other innovations such as apps that have evolved. In drawing this point to a conclusion, because I'm aware that we're having a minute's silence soon, prior to the pandemic, as I've mentioned, community legal centres in places such as here in Australia have been using video conferencing as a substitute for face-to-face consultations with clients. This does not suit all clients though, and we need to be aware that there is diversity in relation to the client base. Rather than us conceptualizing technology as being an effective replacement for legal aid and advice services, and that face-to-face, the really important face-to-face work that we know is so vital, we suggest that when it's drawn together with research that does examine the nature and extent of legal needs, that technological innovation can play an important role in facilitating the targeting of advice and support towards the different population groups that now do have legal needs, especially highlighting that group with new legal needs. And if there is investment to be placed in technology, that our paper argues must be done in a way that really does account for the different ways that people experience legal problems. So, keeping diversity and acknowledging that at the heart of things. And really also in light of the reality that the parameters of the population groups may continue to shift and change as the implications of the pandemic do become more apparent. So I'm going to hand over now to one of the other speakers for the conclusion.
Brilliant, thank you, Faith. So just to kind of wrap up what we've been talking about, our research really shows that the pandemic obviously has introduced lots of more complex factors to the existing landscape of legal advice for social welfare problems in England and Wales. Particularly, it's exacerbated and highlighted the existing fragilities and vulnerabilities and tensions that existed in this landscape, and we feel like it's really important to emphasize that this is by no means a COVID problem. This is something which highlights a lot of problems which already existed, and if anything, it offers an opportunity to reflect on those fragilities. We know that the sector is adaptable and that it can make effective use of investments in technology if it is properly targeted and supported in the ways that it is in other jurisdictions. And that future investment in technology should, of course, be research-led and also conceptualised as a useful tool to aid the sector rather than as a panacea for replacing their services. Thank you.
That's been absolutely great, just fascinating, just extraordinary actually hearing the wide range of views on all of this, including how technology can be useful and how it can not be useful. And I think a very clear message coming out about how the sector that is providing this help has been, and certainly looking at it at the moment, will be as vulnerable as the individuals using it. And I think that point about the long-standing underinvestment in the sector coinciding with this huge increase in demand and the continuing increase in demand that I think we're going to see as things move forward, I think is going to be a real challenge for all of us. So thank you, all of you, very much indeed. What I would like to do is just briefly pick up a point that was made by Linda Tukey in the chat point, which is illustrative, I think, of both the pluses and minuses of technology. She says she worked at a community legal advice centre in Portsmouth and now manages a team of money advice and benefits advisors at a housing association. She'd be interested in being involved in research. She's found Microsoft Teams a godsend for the team working. And I think that's really interesting, the points that you all made about using technology to get teams in organizations together and also to get people across the sector together. And Robin's roundtables, from which you last three have drawn so much of your research, have been a wonderful example of that, because we've been able to have very wide-ranging meetings with people from all over the country, not having to travel, and yet getting together and feeling part of a community. And Linda has said it's been great for doing three-way calls to the DWP and particularly useful in overcoming rules regarding explicit consent and universal credit. And I thought that was just such a useful point, because this business of helping people remotely, actually getting explicit consent is such a big issue. And things like doing it on the phone, helping people on the phone, getting explicit consent is also quite tough. Now, we've got 6 minutes until noon, so I'm glad to see I see Linda's asked a question as well. Now, Alexandra Murray was very quick off the mark, asking questions, so she gets her reward because she gets the first question. She's got a question for Naomi and Diane, thanking them for the paper and asking if there's an idea for a follow-up survey. So Naomi and Diane, can you answer that question? I'm keeping an eye on the time. You've got 4 or 5 minutes.
Oh yeah, I won't take that long, and I'll shoot first because I think this is an easy one to answer. So in an ideal world, yes, we would like to do a follow-up survey. What we realized with the survey we did during the pandemic, we sent it out to the same advice providers that we had sent out the digitalization survey. And we realized that everyone is in a survey fatigue, and we were so grateful to have 133 advice providers respond. So ideally, in about 6 months' time, we would send out another survey using the same methodology with a follow-up report to see what that looks like. Diane, would you like to add something to that?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I think, underpinned by what we've just heard is about the resilience of the advice sector. And one of my fears is if we do this follow-up report in 6 months or a year's time, that there will be fewer advice sectors available because of the cuts to legal aid, because of the lack of funding and the strain that we're seeing and the vulnerabilities of the advice sector. It may well be that there will be less advice sectors for us to actually analyse at that time, and that's a big concern.
Yeah, yes, I think that's a concern. We all share that vulnerability. So I think if there are policymakers attending as participants, I hope that they're going to hoist in that concern, because I know they want to make sure that people are helped, but you can't help individuals unless you've got the organisations that know how to do it. And Alexandra has also asked a follow-up question, which is for Jess, Daniel and Faith, about social welfare law has suffered from lack of interest and funding in general, and wondering if you agree, and if there are any universities that still teach welfare law, because there doesn't seem to be a career path. Who would like to answer that?
Yeah, I'm happy to pick that up. I
Thank
think
you,
it's a
Dan.
really good point. So I've just written a book that comes out in a couple of months with John Robbins called Justice in a Time of Austerity. We went around England and Wales talking to social welfare lawyers. We were at law centres, we were at various different organisations. And that theme came up again and again about how we do this work because we're so committed to it. But where are the next generation going to come from? It's not a viable career unless you want to do something purely on a passion basis. And you're absolutely right, Alexandra, there are so few universities in England and Wales that offer social welfare law. I don't know any off the top of my head. I think there's a couple. We used to do it at Cardiff, but long before I came here. So it's hard enough to get that experience, but it's hard to get work experience. And to be honest, you might have experienced this, but students are generally put off pursuing legal aid as a career full stop at universities. We always encourage students to go into the well-remunerated areas of the law. And it's only the odd little student here and there who knows that perhaps my interests are in criminal legal aid and in social welfare law who might come to me. I've had a couple this year say, "Oh, Dan, is this actually a real career? Could I do this? Because I've got no idea how I do it, and I have to organise little bits of experience for them." Apart from that, I think it easily fall down the cracks because there is so little social welfare law in universities. So I know it came up again and again in my interviews around England and Wales that the social welfare lawyers doing it now were really worried about the future. Who is going to replace them? And I know I'm very wary at the time, so I don't want to go on too long, but I know a couple of examples that came up, one in South Wales, one in the southeast of England, about law centres that had opportunities for housing solicitors, and they couldn't fill them because there was nobody who could come through and actually give that expertise to do it. So they actually had a job for someone in social welfare law, but there was no one who could fill it. And I'm going to stop there because I don't want to speak over the minute silence.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you for your beautiful timing. And I think as noon comes round, we all stop and think.
Okay, it's 1 minute past 12 now. Thank you.
Thank you, Heidi. Thank you. Now, does anybody else want to say any more about that question from Alexandra about the career path, welfare, social welfare law?
I might just say, although it's not, obviously England and Wales centric, but through the legal education pathway of clinics, and I'm guessing Dan might be able to make a point about England and Wales, but so I coordinate a youth law clinic that's teamed up with Legal Aid. So I actually had a 3-hour session with students today on that. So I do think that there are a number of students who are very passionate and willing, and I think it's up to us as educators in the university to definitely, help to provide the opportunities for students. And I see that Professor Gráinne McKeever's asked a question, and actually Professor McKeever's work at the University of Ulster was mentioned today by one of the guest speakers in the clinic. So really, I think there are examples throughout where, academics are in universities providing, and coordinating things with the community legal centres, and that can provide an opportunity. But it's the infrastructure and the structures in terms of, that appeal. It's not the same as the presentations from the corporate law firms. But I do think that there are a number of students who are keen to be involved in that type of work. So,
thank you. Jess, do you want to add to that?
No, just that the enthusiasm is there, I find. So at Cardiff, obviously, Dan and I work together quite closely, and we are currently designing an Access to Justice module. We teach students about our research all the time, and the enthusiasm is always there. But again, just to reiterate what everybody has said, the tendency tends to be that they would start very keen and very excited, and then that enthusiasm does wane because of the limited opportunities that there are in the sector. And I think that might be reinforced. So at the moment, Dan and I are also doing a workforce survey of the legal aid workforce across the board in civil and family law, including social welfare as well. So that might help us to identify some of those barriers and some of the specific tensions that exist in barriers to the profession, specifically in that area.
Thank you. So great question, Alex. Thanks very much. Now, Gráinne McKeever, thank you for your comment on the great presentations. Absolutely agree on that. And your question, which you've said is unfair, what are the implications for the public services that advice can facilitate access to, tribunals, local authorities, etc.? Is this yet another front that the advice sector needs to fight on, encouraging these public services to be more flexible in response to the new and existing legal needs arising from the pandemic? Now, who'd like to go first on that?
I don't mind having a first go at that.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. It is unfair, but it is completely on the nose as well, because you can't separate out the interconnectedness of them. And I'm somebody who comes at this from a family law perspective about how the family court is seen as the worst place that somebody could potentially go, and that they should resolve their problems outside of that environment. But advice, of course, is key in being able to do that, and also being able to access effectively the more formal context as well. And I think that's a real kind of difficulty with policy at the moment, is it loses that idea that the initial advice and proper support from an advice sector can be so useful and essential in ensuring that people can access and make use of those extra services. So yeah, the fight is definitely interconnected. And actually, maybe in terms of the impact of COVID as well, I wondered whether technology is also something which intersects both the provision of advice and the ways that those tribunals or courts function. So that might be something that Faith might want to pick up on.
Faith.
That definitely came up in our case studies in relation to, there were people that needed assessments for housing and various other issues that they were experiencing. And there were talk about, in the case studies, about the huge delays, about the assistance that people needed to use, tech for hearings, and actually some people delaying participation because of tech issues. So I think that it was having a huge knock-on effect in relation to people's experiences as a whole. And in our case studies, there were a whole range of examples, and that was something that those that were involved from the advice sector really highlighted, that there is a huge digital divide, and particularly for clients in that older age bracket, that was highlighted as well in relation to the experiences. So I hope that helps answer the question.
Yes, I think that's really interesting. And of course, one of the things that we haven't yet seen with the online court or online tribunals is the Briggs Stage 1, which is meant to help people to recognise that the problem that they've got has got a legal solution. And I think that that's going to become more and more needed as we see all of these problems developing in the future. And we also see, in my view, insufficient use made of signposting on Gov.uk, which it doesn't really signpost enough to services that provide people with a better understanding of their issues in an empathetic way. I mean, currently, I'm arguing for more signposting to be made to Citizens Advice and Shelter, and to the organisation I chair, Advice Now, because we know that you can actually be empathetic digitally. I mean, you wouldn't think you could be empathetic by a website, but you can. And people say that they felt supported, but they increasingly signpost to legal choices, which is basically just a route through to a lawyer, whereas we know that most people with these problems can't afford a lawyer, or even on family issues. And Jess may have noticed this, to Wikivorce, which is not a suitable place to go for advice on family issues. It's highly unsuitable. Now, interestingly, the point you made, Faith, about people finding it difficult to access services, Linda Tukey has made this point too. She said, access to data is a problem for people with low incomes. So video conferencing is not always possible. We found that clients are reluctant to use it. Have you found this to be a problem? And I would be really interested to know if any of you have found ways in which you've been able to overcome this access to data, access to devices issue. Who's going to go first on that?
Amanda, if I'll jump in on that just really quickly. From my own practice, dealing with people who've got welfare benefit issues and are appealing a welfare benefit decision, many of my clients don't have access to any technology at all. They don't even have a smartphone. And the only practical way around that is for me to facilitate that by allowing them to come to the law centre and have a room either to perform a telephone hearing or a video hearing, because in order to scale up, and talking about the resilience, in order to scale up knowledge and ability for these vulnerable community members to be able to do that alone, it's going to take a very, very long time, and a lot of integrated collaboration between different service providers and different stakeholders. And until that is acknowledged, I think the only practical solution from my own way and my own practice is to actually enable the service users to come here and have the facilities to be able to access technology.
Thank you. And yes, I've heard that from a number of different places. Any other practical comments on that, Naomi?
May I add to that? So what I felt, and I don't know if it's the same from your other guys' research and findings, is that the transition to the forced digital by demand through the pandemic, there was this massive goodwill of both sides, of both the advice providers providing the service as also the users of the service. But it transpired that the end result might be something hybrid, where everyone told us that face-to-face just cannot be replaced by digital. So similar to what Diane said, that she did see people face-to-face somehow throughout, that some of the advice providers did that as well with some of their clients they could actually get hold of. And that in other places that you would use the digital that worked well at this point, you continue to do that, but that there's always going to be a need for certain groups of people to have that face-to-face contact, and that's really, really important. And that goes on to what we all found of those who are digitally abandoned, basically falling off the track at the moment. So what we've heard and seen a lot is that this call for this hybrid model of face-to-face needs to still be available for people. And the digital is good when it works for those who it does work. And then, of course, the next big problem, which I'm not going to elaborate on, I just want to mention, is then does it create the same type of advice or justice for the people, right? So for those who are digitally able and can access justice or advice, at midnight when they choose to do so and get a resolution, or the person who doesn't have a phone, who doesn't have data, who has to travel and then queue and wait and get advice. And is that the same type of advice and justice? But that's something for another day. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with that. And I think that kind of feeds into everything we were talking about in terms of vulnerability and how it's experienced everybody is experiencing vulnerability at the moment in some shape or form. Everybody is feeling the impact of the pandemic, but the actual particular and unique way that is being experienced is something we need to pay really close attention to, I think, going forward, not just in the middle of the pandemic, but in the post-pandemic world, if we can imagine it. It's the idea that people will experience vulnerability. Maybe perhaps that could be ameliorated by online guides in some cases, but effectively we would need to track that, to do research to understand exactly what the implications of that experience would be, especially as Gráinne said, going on into other tribunals and other spaces where people might resolve their problems. And then, of course, there's the other side of it where you're right, there are some client groups who will need face-to-face support and that holistic emotional support, which is so specific to the pre-pandemic world. So yeah, I think that's a lot of food for thought and a lot to do in one webinar, possibly.
Thank you. No, well, it's interesting because Law for Life has been wrestling with this problem of how do you reach the disappeared. And before the pandemic, we were running housing rights courses for community workers who were supporting vulnerable women. And in fact, our first course was, we had a course which was due to start this time last year. And guess what? We couldn't do it in person. In fact, all the participants said, well, actually, we don't want to come and sit in a room with 20 other people. And in 6 weeks, the team pivoted in order to deliver it remotely through 6 weekly webinars of 2 hours each, which people were doing in the evenings after their incredibly grueling jobs. And virtually everybody came for the whole 6 weeks. They all said it was so useful. We ran some additional stuff, which was designed to help them get their heads around how to use their local councillors and how to use judicial review. Unbelievably complex subjects on housing rights for vulnerable women. And we were teaching people from 22 organisations, and we did an assessment afterwards. And they themselves assessed that they had been able to help 4,000 clients, vulnerable, digitally excluded clients, as a result of that course. So the multiplier effect was just enormous. And we've run more core courses since then for both vulnerable women and for refugees, running them more recently on Saturday mornings because that was what people asked for. So these are people giving up 2 hours on a Saturday morning, 6 weeks to learn about housing rights, which is an incredibly complex area of law. I mean, just fantastically complex. And we're now running shorter sessions, 3 weekly sessions, mainly aimed at social prescribing link workers. I don't know if you've come across social prescribing link workers in the Southwest and in the Northwest. They too have been totally oversubscribed. And the first session, which was run, actually, I think it was run in working time yesterday, Monday, it emerged that social prescribers are the people to ask to do vulnerability assessments, because they actually know these vulnerable people who need vulnerability assessments much better than the GPs do. So that's a tip to all advice workers. If you're looking for vulnerability assessment, try and find out if your client has got a social prescribing link worker and try and get them one if they haven't, because that's obviously a really good route into getting the information that you need to get. I was very interested in Faith talking about the hybrid model, which is a sort of theme that's come up from a variety of contributions. Faith, can you give us some of the learning from Australia and how you think it might apply here, in particular sort of different channels for different sorts of people?
Yeah, thanks, Amanda. Yeah, it's a really great point, and I think that Naomi has described it so well in relation to the diversity really of clients. Now, I've just finished up a study with young people, children and young people, about online harms for an organisation in the UK. And what really struck me about that was young people mentioning that they wanted to actually speak to someone on the phone when they were making a complaint. So I assumed that, you know, given that everything's online, I had this assumption that they would much prefer a system that involved, you know, some sort of an online redress mechanism. But no, overwhelmingly, the children and young people in that study, over 50 kids, said they wanted to actually speak to someone. So I think we can't make assumptions about particular groups either. And I think it's really interesting that we assume a lot about young people, perhaps in relation to their legal needs, and actually, you know, thinking that this type of technology would be really something that young people in particular would want to have, but actually, in contrast, sometimes research shows us the opposite. But in terms of Australia, you know, there have been various examples during COVID where particularly those who are experiencing gender and family violence, where, you know, we've had particularly in Melbourne, where I was living, we had, you know, huge restrictions on movement. And also, you know, tech does, you know, mobile phones can be monitored by partners as well, but there have been developments of apps which can be concealed on a phone that actually will provide people with support and with advice. And these, you know, emerging research is showing that these, you know, innovations are particularly helpful and useful. I think that, you know, when you speak to, and I know this through the clinic work that I do, that when you speak with people about the face-to-face, and it's anecdotal, but particularly those in relation to, you know, where English isn't their first language, migrant populations, and those that have disabilities, that and we know emerging research is showing as well that here in Australia and New Zealand, when courts went online, that there were huge challenges and a lot of extra support needed from organisations in New Zealand, such as Talking Trouble. So technology isn't, you know, always the best means, and it's not to say that it's a smooth process to use it either. Sorry, Amanda, I hope that answered the question.
Sorry, need to unmute. That's really got to do it at least once. That's really interesting. And it's very interesting about young people, isn't it? Because as Saudis all assume that actually young people are going to be completely digitally savvy, and actually, blow me down, they want to talk to someone on the phone, you know, or face to face. And not all old people are digitally incapable either. Now, James Sambach has put a point in, which I think, James, it'd be useful if you put it in the chat so everybody can see it. LawWorks is running a clinics event on Thursday, which I'm going to actually, about how clinics can access hard to reach communities. And I think Mary Marvell is going to be talking about our housing rights courses on that. Picking up on the student social welfare law training and experience, as Faith says, there's a lot happening in clinics, and he gives a link to LawWorks Law School Pro Bono and Clinics Report 2020. But he's got a question. Something to consider is whether clinic work can be part of the SQE's qualifying work experience pathway into the profession. Any thoughts on this, panel?
I think it should be, and they do that here in Australia. So I think it definitely should be if it isn't already. And there are models to look to where, you know, that's operating and working elsewhere. And the Community Legal Centre in Australia is hugely vibrant, and that is a pathway for people in relation to their practical training. So that's definitely part of things here.
Yeah, I think that's really useful, and I agree. I think I'm always somebody who thinks that students should get involved in everything, because there's nothing better than hands-on training and that sort of thing. And so we have a module at Cardiff as well called Law in the Community, where we send them off to volunteer at things like support through court or victim support helplines, and that is great because they come out of that with obviously it contributes to their grades, and they have some real worldly experience which really helps them go off, and a lot inspires quite a lot of them to go on into careers in legal aid, which is great. But at the same time, there is always this debate about, well, are students and volunteers filling the gap, which should inevitably be funded more securely by the state? And so there's almost a balance between not wanting to leave people adrift and wanting to fill that gap, but then also almost concealing the extent of need and support that there is, which is a really delicate balance, I think, and it's a really hard debate.
Yes, I used to be a trustee of LawWorks shortly after I retired from Ministry of Justice. And actually one of the points we made then, and which LawWorks made now, is there is no way that pro bono can fill the gap. It is, you know, it is just putting things in the cracks. It's not filling the gaps. Any other points on those issues? Final thoughts from each of you, just very quickly. Naomi.
Thank you. I just managed to hit the unmute button in time. What I think is that we definitely know and have also empirically identified that there is a problem and lots of challenges ahead. I think it would be optimal to use the things that worked well during the pandemic and keep them going. So not go back to what we used to think was good, but use what we've now learned works and keep that, but also be very aware of the massive gaps and challenges and try to really actively fill those.
Thank you. Yes, I agree, absolutely. Build back better, learn what's worked, don't let's abandon it. It's made such a difference to people's time. Diane.
Yeah, I would agree with Naomi entirely. The only thing I can add is that I think what the pandemic has shown us, it's provided another opportunity for closer networking, thinking together and collaboration. And that includes actually with public services, with local authorities, housing associations. And I think we should galvanise the learning from that and use that moving forward, because I think that collaboration is the way to unlock a lot of the issues that we've got with vulnerable people in society.
Well, that's really interesting. So it's not just collaboration within the sector, it's actually collaborations with the initial decision makers and sometimes the source of all the trouble.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Yes, and this remote getting together gives us an opportunity to do that in a very resource economical way. Now, Dan, you've been joined by your lively, who's been a delight to everybody. I just think he's cheered up lots of people's day. Would you like to make a point?
Yeah, sorry, I've got both of them here causing
Oh, wow.
chaos. Yeah, say hello to everyone. Hello. Sorry, everyone says hello. Yeah, I think maybe the most important point from doing this research for me is that it's an opportunity to shine a light onto all the problems which are already in the system, the problems which have been caused by austerity, and even more deeper rooted than that. Suddenly attention is shown on the flaws there are in the state provision around social welfare law, because suddenly loads more people need help. And they start to say, well, I assumed, because you hear all the stories about legal aid, the assumption is that anyone can get legal aid. Well, suddenly people are getting into problems, they're losing their jobs. They're realizing their employer wasn't as kind as they thought they might be. They're finding they're not qualified for the benefits, which they were perhaps always told they would be qualified for. Thank you for all bearing with this. And then when they actually try to get that help, they realize it's not there. So maybe we can use this as an opportunity to keep attention on this hole in the middle of what should be our state support, and use that going forward to help with our future campaigns about showing the importance of legal aid for access to justice and the importance of access to justice to our rights as citizens. And I'll turn off there because I imagine it goes quite quickly from being cute to annoying to have two kids shouting in the background. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, kids, for noises off. I think that's an absolutely brilliant point, that this is now affecting so many people who thought legal aid was a problem for somebody else. And I think you're absolutely right. I think that's something the sector does need to think about and build on now and over the coming year, because suddenly it's going to be a problem for lots of people who never thought they could possibly be in this situation. I think that's absolutely right. Jess.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, yeah, exactly. I think the point of our paper is it exposes these fragilities, but also these opportunities, which obviously feeds into what Naomi was talking about. We've learned a lot in this pandemic about how to make things more accessible. And that's not just limited to legal advice. We probably come across that in our own work as well. I know from lecturing, we've realized how easy it actually was to make adjustments for people with learning difficulties or physical disabilities by doing things remotely. And that's not something we should be keen to lose post-pandemic. But at the same time, we've also realized how much potential there is. So the roundtables, which formed part of the empirical basis for our research, they were conducted and pulled together in a remarkable short space of time. The law sector roundtables began in March, right at the beginning of the lockdown, which really shows that the sector is very resilient in its own, it's very innovative in terms of how it draws together resources and can work together in times of crisis. So imagine how incredibly resilient it might be if we also invest in that and made sure it had to secure support in terms of financial funding.
Thank you, Jess. And Faith, final from across the world. And thank you for staying up so late.
Thank you, everyone. I would just say in relation to that point on diversity that, not one size fits all. And, this kind of emphasis on technology can address technology, is an answer. We need to be building up an evidence base and be, somewhat cautious about putting all of our eggs in the technology basket, because as our case studies showed, those working in the sector who are hugely committed to their client base and, went to, various, quite, thoughtful methods in relation to trying to get back in contact with people who had fallen off the radar. That partnership with, for example, with the food banks, really trying to think outside of the box in relation to getting, contact with people, particularly those that are experiencing homelessness. And I think that committed community is so vitally important. And I think that Naomi's and Diane's study have shown that, also that sector themselves, they're going through in their own lives challenges during the pandemic as well, and they also have that care towards their clients. So I think that there's a lot more research, I think, to be done on the emotional labour for the sector itself as well. So thank you so much for the invite to present today.
Well, I'd like finally to thank all our panelists for their great presentations, and actually for a great and really rewarding discussion too. Thank you to those of you who asked questions and contributed comments as well. Thank you to everybody for coming. We had a really great audience, and it's fantastic to see that such an important issue can actually garner such an interesting and wide-ranging audience bang in the middle of the morning. Massive thanks to Heidi Bancroft for organising this. She has just done it so brilliantly. I'm sure all the panel members agree. And to Sally Hunt, who's been hosting us. And thanks to Maddie Breen, who's not here, who helped at the beginning when all the technology went slightly haywire before we all started. So thank you all very much indeed. Have a great rest of the day and a great rest of the week, and look forward to seeing you all again, especially the kids.